Okay, so first, thank you very much for having me. Today I'm going to be talking about choice, welfare, and market design. I'm going to be discussing the allocation of food to food banks. This work is still a little bit of a work in progress, so your thoughts and comments would be really, really appreciated. So many organizations are faced with the problem of allocating heterogeneous objects that arrive stochastically over time. So councils have to allocate public housing among tenants, for example. And a central question here is just how much choice should agents have over their allocations? To what extent should agents be able to signal and act on their preferences and so have power in determining their allocations? Now, a key margin in sort of determining the benefits of allowing agents choice is going to be the degree of heterogeneity in agents' preferences and the degree of substitutability of objects. So, for example, if we have a single unit of public housing and a number of potential tenants, then if every tenant values that house exactly the same, then for efficiency, it won't matter which tenant we give that unit of housing to. And so, estimating the degree of heterogeneity in preferences and the substitutability of objects is going to be very important in order to do any sort of welfare analysis and so assess the benefits of choice. Now, today I'm going to be talking about the allocation of food to food banks. So I'm going to be talking about these food rescue organizations that receive often multiple donations of food each day. We're talking about large truckloads of, say, cornflakes, and they have to decide which of their network of food banks they're going to send this food to. And this is a problem faced by numerous organizations around the world, including Fair Share in the UK, the Federation of European Food Banks in mainland Europe, and Feeding America here in the United States. So to talk a little bit about Feeding America, food banks have become an integral part of US society, with 1 in 7 Americans making regular use of a Feeding America affiliated food bank. And this statistic comes from before the pandemic, and we know that food bank use has only increased since then. Feeding America directly distributes around 100,000 tons of food each year to food banks, which is enough food to feed around 130,000 people each day. And so achieving an efficient and equitable allocation of food is a key priority for Feeding America. Now, before 2005, Feeding America used to allocate this food by essentially offering it to food banks at random. And this was extremely unpopular. And this is because different food banks want different types of food from Feeding America. A food bank in rural Tennessee that's surrounded by farms is likely to have a weaker preference for fresh fruit and veg than a food bank in central Manhattan. And this is because, as well as receiving food from Feeding America, food banks also receive food from local donors, so local farms, for example. And importantly, what a food bank wants is liable to change over time, for example, after a bad harvest. And so in 2005, in order to give food banks some choice over the food that they were receiving, working with a team of economists at the University of Chicago, Feeding America introduced an auction system, also known as the choice system. And under this system, food banks place bids on food using fake money. And food banks in areas with more poverty get more of this fake money to bid with. I'm going to talk in more detail about this mechanism later on. Since its introduction, food banks have reported a lot of satisfaction with this system, at least relative to the previous system. So today I'm going to be asking, okay, how does welfare compare under these two systems? What are the benefits of allowing food banks to choose their allocations in this way? I'm also going to be asking, what are the factors that are driving this difference? So, what are some of the important aspects of these mechanisms? And although I'm not really going to have time to talk about it today, I'm also going to be interested in whether other food bank networks could benefit from adopting a similar system by essentially considering some of the mechanisms that are used by other food bank networks around the world that are usually somewhat more sophisticated than the old system used by Feeding America. So let me tell you a little bit more about Feeding America. We're talking about large warehouses that are filled to the brim with various types of food. These food banks have fleets of trucks at their disposal to send out all across the states, picking up and dropping off food as it is needed. Feeding America works with 200 food banks across the country, and a broad variety of food gets distributed in this way. The way that this whole sort of ecosystem works is that someone like Kellogg's will donate a truckload of cornflakes to Feeding America, who then have to decide which of their food banks to send this food to. These food banks send this food on to food pantries, so local churches and community centers, who are then the people that actually distribute this food in the communities. Now, like I said, food banks also receive food from local donors, so local farms, local grocery shops, even local factories. On average, food banks receive around 75% of their food from these local donors, but there's a lot of variation in this across food banks. Now, in this talk, I'm going to predominantly focus on Feeding America distributing food to food banks because that's what I have data on. So I'm going to assume that food banks are, choosing food with the best interests of the food pantries in mind. But one problem that I have is that a key determinant of what food banks want from Feeding America is going to be their stocks. How much cereal they have, how many vegetables they have. But I don't observe food bank stocks. I don't observe the food that they give out to food pantries, nor do I observe the food that they are receiving from local donors. And so this is going to be a key challenge that I'm going to have to try and overcome. So what do I want to do? I want to estimate food banks' demand functions and see how these vary both across food banks and across time. I then want to run a series of counterfactual simulations, simulating equilibrium allocations, both under this auction system and under a number of alternate mechanisms. But there are a number of challenges here. So first of all, there's this intertemporal substitution. We know that food banks are solving a dynamic problem. We know that they treat these truckloads of food like durable goods, winning a load of cereal and then working through that truckload of cereal, giving it out to their food pantries before returning to bid on the choice system, on the auction system, sorry. So for example, a food bank will have to consider, do I bid on cornflakes today or do I wait until tomorrow when maybe something like granola is available? The next problem I have is that I only observe food banks' bids. I don't observe their values. So I'm going to need some sort of auction model to allow me to back out their values. A complicating factor here is that I actually have many auctions happening simultaneously. So I'm actually going to need to use a multi-object auction model, which just complicates this a little bit more. And finally, as I said, I don't observe food bank stocks. So I'm going to need to basically just take into account that I'm not observing my state variable. So what I'm going to be doing is estimating a dynamic multi-object auction model with this unobserved state. And this is going to present a number of challenges, both for identification and estimation that I'll talk more about shortly. Where's this sitting in the literature? Well, okay, so the thing to say here is I'm building on some previous work by Canis Prendergast, who was one of the original designers of this auction system. And my structural approach is going to be very complementary to Canis's predominantly descriptive and also kind of sufficient statistics-y approaches. What this is going to allow me to do is to push deeper into some of these questions, understanding where these welfare benefits are coming from, and also to consider other mechanisms of interest. I'm also making a bit of I don't want to stress this too much, but a little bit of a methodological contribution here. So I have this other paper that discusses the identification and estimation of a dynamic multi-object auction game. And in this, I essentially come up with a kind of new estimation method that I'm going to talk about quite a bit today. And what I do in this paper is I just extend this to account for the unobserved state. I'm currently working actually on extending this identification framework for these unobserved states to the discrete choice context. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about this auction system. So under this system, every truckload of food is put to auction in a simultaneous first price sealed bid format. We have around 30 lots being auctioned simultaneously each day. Food banks place bids on loads using a fake currency known as shares, and daily allocations of this fake money are determined by local poverty rates. Food banks can save this fake money, they can even borrow this fake money, and they're also able to place negative bids down to a reservation price of -2,000. And this is just going to help shift undesirable loads, making sure that every truckload of food is graciously accepted by food banks so that donors keep donating food in future. And the final thing to say is that the supply of this fake money varies with the food supply to ensure that on average prices remain constant. And oh yeah.
So could you walk me through the intuition of what negative bid of negative say 100 would mean? And yeah.
I will talk about this a little more later on, but basically it's just because sometimes food banks have to be paid to accept food. Maybe they have transportation costs. That means they have to pay to transport it to them, or just because of storage costs. And they just want to incentivize food banks to take all this food. Okay. I'm going to be working with 4 years worth of bidding data. So that's data on around 25,000 unique auctions. I have all the information on the goods being auctioned, and I have both the identities and bids of both winners and losers. I also have nice data on my food banks, the catchment areas, all the counties that they serve, as well as poverty rates. But what I don't have is data on these stocks, on local donations, nor on the food that gets sent to food pantries. So that's going to be the key challenge that I'll be focusing on today. Yep.
More questions. I can have this one. So what triggers an auction? Is it a big donation, or is it that somebody puts something in there?
So basically all the food that gets donated is big. And so it's just one truckload of cornflakes or whatever. It's just received and then it's auctioned the very next day. Importantly, they are essentially batching these loads so that you just have one set of auctions each day. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my oh yeah.
For the fixed money, can a food bank carry over the funds?
Yeah. So they can save over time and borrow. So it's essentially an intertemporal budget constraint.
And then every day or every month they get allocated a certain amount as well.
Yeah, so what actually happens is that all of the money that's spent on one day gets reallocated for the next day in these sort of like splits according to how much poverty there is. So there's they also add more money to the system and take money away to vary the money supply, but broadly that's it.
And all this will be observed how they do it.
Yes, pretty much. Okay. So I'm now going to motivate this model. I'm going to try and build a model that can incorporate 4 key observed facts. First of all, heterogeneity. I observe systematic differences in bidding behavior, both across food banks and across time. And in particular, this variation over time is quite persistent. So I will see a food bank bid very aggressively on cereal for a few days. They'll maybe win multiple loads of cereal, but then all of a sudden they'll just stop bidding on cereal. They'll go a few days, weeks, or even months without bidding on cereal, and then out of the blue, come back to bidding on cereal again. So I've got this time-varying unobserved heterogeneity that I want to try and understand, and I'm just going to attribute this to these unobserved stocks. So I'm going to say that the reason the food bank has stopped bidding on cereal is because they've started receiving cereal from these local donors. I'm also going to have a dynamic model. So I have this anecdotal evidence that food banks are both forward-looking and dynamic, treating food as food from Feeding America as almost like durable, winning cereal, working through that cereal. And so what I see is that after winning a load of, let's say, cereal, food banks stop bidding on cereal for a few days, on average. Importantly, I don't see that they stop bidding on other types of food, so this isn't just about the budget constraint. Furthermore, I have many lots being auctioned simultaneously, and these lots, sometimes they're perfect substitutes, sometimes they're imperfect substitutes. So food banks are actually solving quite a complex combinatorial problem, trying to figure out, which combination of lots to bid on. And I want to take this into account, and I'm going to do that by using a multi-object auction framework. Finally, I have these negative prices. But more than that, I have infrequent bidding. So the average food bank actually bids not very often. And if a food bank doesn't place a bid when they're allowed to bid negative, that tells me they have a negative marginal valuation for that lot, which tells me they have to be paid to accept that lot. This tells me there's some sort of costs going on. Transportation costs, but in particular in this setting, it turns out there's going to be storage costs that are really important. Just the fact that you're having to store all this cereal somewhere in your warehouse. Okay, so I'm going to put together a model. I'm going to do quite a sort of a high-level description of the model. So food banks place bids that are going to be some function of their beliefs about how other food banks are, how aggressively other food banks will be bidding, and also a function of their payoffs. The exact form of this function will depend on my assumptions about the strategic environment. So I'm going to assume independent private values, risk neutral bidders, and I'm going to take into account this this budget constraint by basically just assuming that food banks have quasi-linear payoffs, quasi-linear in this fake money. But I'm going to allow the marginal value of wealth to vary across food banks. So I'm going to say, different food banks can have a different opportunity cost of spending 1 unit of this fake currency. So a food bank that receives lots of this fake money might have a lower value for that one last unit of fake money than a food bank that receives very little of this fake money. Where are these payoffs coming from? In part, they're going to be determined by food bank stocks. So I'm going to say that if a food bank ends the period with stocks S, they receive payoff J of S, where J is just a flow payoff function. This is going to capture both the utility of holding food in order to give out to food pantries, and also these storage costs. So when I focus on these stocks, which are going to be my state variable, I'm going to focus on food according to how it's stored. So that's going to be dried food that's quite light but bulky, tinned or bottled food that's heavy and dense, food that needs to be refrigerated, and food that is fresh and so liable to spoil. Now, as I said, this is a dynamic model. So how a food bank bids is also going to depend on their continuation value. So a food bank is going to take into account, okay, if I win cornflakes today, then maybe I won't have room to store any granola that gets auctioned tomorrow. And finally, I have this little, this U that's a lot-specific idiosyncratic value that's going to depend, it's going to capture my transportation costs. It's also going to capture variation in lot-specific attributes that's just unobserved by the econometrician. Now, as I said, I don't observe stocks, so I'm going to assume a stock process. I'm going to say that your stocks today are a function of your stocks from yesterday, as well as your winnings from yesterday, and this random variable X, which is just going to give your local donations minus the food that you've sent out to local food pantries. And I'm going to assume that this random variable X is exogenous. Now, a key question is, are these model primitives identified? In particular, can I identify the flow payoff function J and the distribution of net donations F? Now, identification is a real challenge in this framework for a number of reasons, but in particular, that I'm going to focus on today, is the challenge caused by these unobserved states. So I'm trying to identify a function of a variable that I don't observe. However, the model remains identified. Oh, yeah?
So it seems like did other food banks observe the stocks of the rivals? Because it seems like there'd be a learning problem if there was a serially correlated private value in the offer, right?
Yeah, so they don't observe the stocks of other food banks. The way that I treat the kind of the states of others is I just focus on the aggregate state, so the total amount of food being allocated. This is this is an interesting question. Let's talk more about this later, I think, because it gets a little bit difficult.
You're not playing against the same, you don't pretend like you're bidding against the same 3 food banks every round. You feel like you're bidding against a completely different set of food banks.
It'll be the same set of food banks. The way I model it is kind of like you're bidding against a sort of a mass of other people, essentially. Okay, so the model remains identified using 2 sources of observed, 2 sources of variation. So I use observed variation in both the size and composition of lots being auctioned to pin down this flow payoff function J. So I look to see how a food bank bids when 1 load of cornflakes is available. I see that they always bid on that 1 load of cornflakes. I then look to see how they bid when there are 10 loads of cornflakes available. But I see that they still only place bids on that 1 load of cornflakes. This tells me that they don't want to win too many loads of cornflakes. They can't afford to win and then store too many loads of cornflakes, pinning down these storage costs in particular. I then look to see, I then use I then use observed variation in food banks winnings to pin down the distribution of net donations. So I see that a food bank wins a load of cornflakes and they stop bidding on cornflakes. They can't afford to store these cornflakes, any more cornflakes. I then see that on average, it takes 4 days for this food bank to return to bidding on cornflakes again. What does that tell me? Well, that tells me that on average, it takes 4 days for them to give out this truckload of cornflakes. And this just pins down the average of these net daily donations. And I can use variation in this return time to pin down the remainder of this distribution. Okay, so now how am I estimating this model? So the standard approach to estimating a dynamic auction model comes from Geoffrey Bonnet and Pessendorfer. And the way this works is we begin by estimating the distribution of equilibrium bids and then use our first order conditions to write the continuation value as a function of this distribution. This is kind of similar to a conditional choice probability approach. Once we know the continuation value, we can just back out the flow payoff function. Unfortunately, I can't do this in a multi-object context. And this is because we can't write the continuation value as a function of the distribution of bids only. And the reason for this is that if I have 10 auctions being held simultaneously, I have 10 bids. So bids are 10-dimensional. But the continuation value depends on the combinatorial outcome from the day's auctions. There are 2 to the power of 10 possible outcomes for this one bidder. So I've essentially got an order problem. My continuation value is 2 to the power of 10-dimensional. So I need a different way of estimating this. And the way that I do this is I use a 3-step estimation procedure. So in the first step, I estimate equilibrium beliefs, so the probability that food bank I wins lot L given bid B. Then in the second step, I estimate the distribution of net donations F and this function K. And this function is just the sum of the flow payoff function and the discounted continuation value. I refer to this function as a pseudostatic payoff function. It's the object that you would estimate if you incorrectly estimated a static model. And the reason that I do this is that it turns out that in the third step, I can write the continuation value as a function of my bids and this function K. This comes from the first order conditions. And essentially, all I'm doing is I make a correction. For any non-additivities across lots, so any complementarities. In this case, substitutabilities caused by these storage costs. So the central estimation problem is just how do I actually estimate this function K? And I do this using a Gibbs sampler. I basically iterate back and forth between two estimation steps. And these 2 steps broadly correspond to the 2 stages of the identification argument I presented previously. So in one step, given a draw of these unobserved stocks, I use variation in the size and composition of lots being auctioned, and essentially just regress this against my bids, pinning down this function K. Then in the S step, given the function K, I draw a sample of these unobserved stocks from their conditional posterior. Once I have a sample of these stocks, I can just estimate the distribution of these net donations. And the way that I draw this sample of stocks is that I observe how winnings affects a food bank's bidding behavior. So I see that they win a truckload of cornflakes and stop bidding on cornflakes. I know that they've won this load of cornflakes, so their stocks have increased by 1 load of cornflakes. I then see that 4 days later, they return to bidding on cornflakes again. Well, that tells me that over those 4 days, they've given out that truckload of cornflakes, so their stocks have decreased by that 1 load of cornflakes. And I just iterate back and forth between these 2 estimation steps until I achieve convergence. The main parametric assumption that I'm making in this model is that this function K is quadratic in stocks. This essentially means I'm assuming linear demand curves. I don't necessarily need to make this. It just simplifies the problem a lot. Okay, so now I'll present some results from this estimation. So here we have estimated, oh yeah.
So can you look at the keep separate step? What are the inputs of step 1 that go into step 2?
Inputs of step 1 that go into step 2. So In the first step, I have basically what I take or what I use in the first step are these unobserved stocks. So I use the draw of these unobserved stocks.
Step bullet number 1 there. Whatever you
Oh. I see. Yeah. Okay. So I'm essentially using the equilibrium beliefs to get a bid shading term, just like in the standard Guerpin-Vong, and that just goes into the predominantly this K step here. So I'm not actually just regressing the available lots on bids. I'm regressing the available lots on bids plus this bid shading term.
The things that you don't know what is the S that gets you that K of S, because the stock is a separate. But you know the K, right? You record the K from step number 1. Is that correct?
I don't get. Oh, hang on. Sorry. Are you still talking about the estimate equilibrium beliefs?
I'm trying to think on what from estimated equilibrium beliefs. Once you get it in the shading, okay, you will give it the shading. That's going to be something, and I'm trying to relate that something to some input of the sampler.
Okay. Basically, it just, so I don't actually work with just bids in the Gibbs sampler. It's bids plus this shading term. That's all I need. That's essentially the only way it comes in. I don't need the stocks that I don't observe to estimate these beliefs. This just comes from, equilibrium. Okay.
Can I like try to restate it? So you take the first price, you take the auction step, and then you say, if I want this, how much will my value function change by? And then that's what's going into the Gibbs sampler, and that's what you're trying to explain to the Gibbs sampler.
That's exactly it. Thank you. Okay. So here we have the estimates of these net donations. I'm showing this for just a subset of food banks. These are the biggest food banks that consume 70% of all the food on this auction system. On average, these estimates are negative, which tells me that on average, food banks give out more food than they receive. This makes sense. Give out more food to food pantries than they receive from their local donors. This makes sense. And the key takeaway here is that I have a lot of variation both across food banks and within food banks across different types of food. Here we have estimates of this marginal flow payoff. So again, on average, these are negative, which tells me that food banks have to, it is costly for food banks to hold food, hence storage costs. And again, I have systematic variation both across food banks and within food banks across different types of food. So this is telling me that I have a lot of heterogeneity essentially in preferences across food banks, and objects are not perfectly substitutable. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about counterfactuals. I'm going to consider, for now, just 3 counterfactual mechanisms. I have this auction system. I have this old system when food banks would queue, they would get offered a load of food, and then whether they accept or reject this load of food, they go to the back of the queue. Finally, I'm also going to consider a random allocation, so just purely sending out food randomly. And this is just a good benchmark allocation mechanism. It's essentially the worst case allocation mechanism we could possibly think of, that's also very cheap and easy to implement. And actually, some food bank systems do something not dissimilar to this. For each of these mechanisms, which predominantly means the old system, I need to solve for the Markov perfect equilibrium. I just do this numerically, finding the fixed point between accept and reject decisions and beliefs. Beliefs about the probability that other food banks are rejecting food. And then I'm going to consider welfare in terms of consumer surplus, which is measured in this virtual currency, which is nice because it's cardinal. So I can make inter-food bank welfare comparisons. But this fake currency doesn't have a very nice interpretation. Like it doesn't really mean anything in the real world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the fact that the money supply varies with the supply of food to ensure that prices remain constant. If the supply of food doubles, the money supply adjusts, prices remain constant, so expenditure doubles. So what I'm going to say is if, as we move from the old system to the auction system, if consumer surplus doubles, then this is kind of like expenditure doubling, which is equivalent to the supply of food doubling. In reality, this is actually going to be a lower bound because, of course, more food comes with more storage costs, but at least it gives me some sort of real world interpretation. So here are my main results. I'm just plotting average daily welfare for my food banks. And the sort of the distribution here is just giving draws from my posterior distribution of parameters that for each one of these draws, I just simulate the mechanism. The main takeaway is that welfare under the auction system is significantly higher than under the old system. On average, it's around 20% higher relative to this random benchmark. Oh, I normalize the average welfare under the random allocation to 0 because I need a location normalization, essentially. But one other thing to take away here is that actually, even the old system is much better than a purely random allocation. So this tells me that just allowing food banks to turn down food is extremely valuable. Okay, where are these benefits coming from? So a key result for the policymakers here is that more food is allocated under the auction system. So it's not the case that food is, under the old system, it was fairly common for food banks to just reject, every food bank would reject a certain load of food. But with the auction system, I get these nice negative prices that convince them to take this extra food. I also have less, oh yeah?
So if a food bank reject the delivery, then what happens? Is it get randomly allocated again?
So it would just work down the priority list of food banks. So the first food bank rejects it, they go to the back of the queue, goes on to the second food bank. And it was not that uncommon for just every food bank to reject certain types of food. Next, we have so just less distance gets traveled under the auction system. This is because food banks are able to sort into consuming closer food. But turns out this actually isn't a major source of welfare gains in this context, because actually transportation costs aren't particularly large. I showed you that picture earlier with these huge fleets of trucks. Transportation costs are likely to be bigger in other contexts. I'm not going to talk about that today. So what I'm finding is that actually the vast majority of these welfare benefits are coming from a reduction in storage costs. Food is just being stored more efficiently now. What I find essentially is happening is that under the old system, food banks would accept food that didn't meet their most pressing need in that moment. So a food bank might accept a load of cornflakes that they're offered, but what they really need is a load of tinned tomatoes. And then later on in the day, they will get offered a load of tinned tomatoes and no longer have room to store it. So either they will turn down that load of tinned tomatoes, or they will accept it and just incur higher storage costs. So actually, the major benefit of the auction system over this old system was that food banks have information about all the lots being allocated that day. And this turns out to be very important. Okay. I also think a little bit about equity. I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail today. But on average, I find that 70% of food banks achieve higher welfare under the auction system than under the old system. And the food banks that benefited under the old system were the food banks that were just really not picky and would essentially hoover up all the food that was rejected by other food banks, almost benefiting from the bad design. Okay, so to conclude, I've been interested in how should Feeding America allocate food among its food banks? How important is it to give food banks choice over the food that they're allocated? I developed a framework to estimate their food banks' demand when stocks were unobserved, and I found that allowing food banks choice is extremely important. There are major welfare gains to be had. And my current work going forwards, there is still a lot more to do on this project, but I'm thinking a lot now about other mechanisms used by other food banks, and I'm also starting to work on actually some of these other food banks systems in more detail. So thank you very much. Questions and comments are very, very welcome.
maybe I missed it, but why not, instead of fake money, why not give them just real money? And let them bid with real money?
Basically, just to ensure that the to make sure that the opportunity cost of spending this fake money, like, you know, they aren't having to trade off with any other concerns they might want to use money for. One thing that we actually see, I don't have the graphs on it, is that relative prices in this system turn out to be very, very different to relative prices in the real economy. So for example, things like pasta and rice that are very cheap in the real world end up being much more expensive in this system. When we think about using real money, you know, there's a worry that these prices and all of the, meh. Yeah, this is worth talking about more later. Yeah. Anything else?
Okay, Ariel, I think it's locked outside, so Nikhil has asked me to announce the coffee break.